So, welcome back to 3rd Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to another of the several battles I was sent by Winged Swordsman 44. This one is going to be on the ruins of OST-IN-EDHIL, which is a fairly difficult settlement to defend. I mean, it is a 5v3 as well, which naturally tends to favour the attackers, but really the openness of this settlement is what makes it a little bit more difficult, because it means the attackers can utilise their own skirmishers to a pretty decent extent. To be fair though, the defensive positions you can take up from a melee combat point of view actually are pretty advantageous, at least on the outer layers of OST-IN-EDHIL. If you do get pushed in a little bit further, it can be difficult to stop a cascading failure in your efforts to prevent the attackers from winning this battle. So really it's one of those where there isn't distinct phases of the defence, it's more like a continuous effort from the defenders to try and hold on to the settlement as a whole, because 3 armies very well fill up most of the defensible area that this map offers you. I believe as well this is more or less a lore-friendly kind of battle, with the kingdoms of Arnor that you would expect to be fighting on the good side joining with the High Elves, which lately we've seen a couple of examples of Imladris supporting Arnor, so it makes a little bit more sense now that Arnor are going to be supporting Imladris instead at the site of some High Elven cultural significance, I suppose we'll call it. Glory days most certainly are behind it, but still worth defending. We'll go through the attacking armies first and foremost, the forces of evil, starting off here with Darth, who's playing as Isengard. Obviously, given the positions of the attacking armies, many of them could be hidden because of the heavy tree cover in this part of the map, but very rarely are we going to see anything in terms of battle down here unless the defending cavalry decides to try and make a bit of a fist of it. Dunland clansmen make that a little bit less likely, however. Isengard just in general are pretty good at being both an attacking army and counteracting cavalry that want to sally forth. The Dunland clansmen are a really good example of that, because they're very cheap, they're really the lowest tier infantry unit Isengard have, but even for a militia spear unit they have a slightly better anti-cavalry bonus, so they definitely have that in their favour. Given the Arnorian kingdoms and of course the High Elves themselves are on the defence, armour piercing is going to be a key part of any orcish effort to try and do damage to either of those groups of factions efficiently, and the Baneguard are one such method. Of all of the, Isengard actually have a lot of armour piercing shock infantry options. Of the basic ones, the Baneguard are the individually tankiest, but they are also the least numerous, so that is worth bearing in mind. But that is the trade-off that you make, and it's the trade-off that Darth here has decided to make. Uruk-hai crossbows, this is the kind of map which, while I did mention that attacking skirmishers can be used to good effect because of the openness of the map, that applies most readily to archers. Banking the shots of crossbows like this, while it still can be effective, it does take away a little bit of their stopping power, generally speaking, so that is certainly worth bearing in mind as the battle goes along. But the threat of crossbows alone from the attackers can be something which the defenders really struggle with very often. Of course, Uruk-hai pikes are a classic part of any good Isengard army. Whether they're committed in the mid-game or the late game, they should be fairly effective. All of the defending factions today could bring pikes of their own, but the Uruk-hai pikes are of course a very central pillar of what Isengard want to be doing. Uruk-hai berserkers, we mentioned earlier how Isengard have got several armour-piercing shock infantry options. This is one of the higher tier versions. Uruk-hai berserkers have got 3 hit points actually, but no other real defensive values to speak of, so once they are gone they melt away very quickly. But while those 3 hit points are up, they could be a real nightmare, especially for the Arnorian defenders among the good teams today. Guards of Orthanc, very tanky, pretty much the opposite to the Uruk-hai berserkers in every way. They're not going to do damage particularly quickly, even for a bodyguard unit. They are ultimately spears at the end of the day, but there you go. Very good defensive unit option. Uruk-hai infantry, of course, are fantastic all-rounder. They are fairly expensive for a unit of line infantry, but they are an upper tier unit of line infantry in the grand scheme of things. Good armour, good shields, decent defensive values, also capable of dishing out damage in ways that perhaps the more standard human line infantry units are not. The very best of the armour-piercing shock infantry Isengard have are the Nazkai, of course, pretty much berserkers on steroids, and we also have some Trolls of the White Hand here as well, which, depending on when exactly they're committed, they could be really effective or melt away pretty quickly under the higher damage units that particularly Arthedain and Imladris have at their disposal. Toomihai, we saw him last time playing as Angmar, and he's going to do so again. Hopefully this time he won't be He drew the short straw in that battle really with how he had to move, and ultimately he was made to pay for that by the defenders on that occasion. We'll see if he is any more fortunate this time around. Angmar Marauders, a numerous infantry unit alongside the Guardians of Cardolan, upper tier and with their armour upgrades. Blackwatch Legion could be very, very useful. As I mentioned, if the outer defensive points do start to crumble for the defenders on this map, it can be very difficult for them to recover from, so the Blackwatch Legion could be absolutely vital in this sort of situation. Upgraded Witch-Round Pikemen are very similar to the Uruk-hai Pikemen, honestly, only they can be brought in fewer numbers by Angmar, but still a very fine unit nonetheless. We saw the Witches actually used quite well last time by this player. It wasn't enough to ultimately save the Angmar efforts, but definitely something which the defenders need to be on the lookout for. And then we have the Witch-Round Blackguard and actually upgraded Witch-Round Hammerguard, so very, very dangerous to any armoured defenders which they can perceive. Then we have the Misty Mountains, played by Vic here. He's got some Snarger skirmishes hidden in and amongst the Cave Trolls. Cave Trolls, of course, can actually have a similar effect to the Blackwatch Legion, only they can push through lines very easily, but for the most part this will ultimately lead to just themselves being in behind enemy lines, rather than the Blackwatch Legion, which can cause other infantry to follow them. Heavy Goblin Infantry and Heavy Goblin Spears here in great numbers. Always good to see that the Misty Mountains go for a numbers-focused approach, because it really helps the attacks in a situation like this. It makes the numbers discrepancy between the two teams very stark indeed. I mean, yes, Heavy Goblin Halberds Infantry and even the Spears are not the highest quality of units, but there are so many of them that they can act as a really good foil to their allies. Heavy Goblin Crossbows will be dangerous for the same reason the Uruk-hai ones are, the difference being, of course, they're a little bit more vulnerable to ranged attacks, so they'll go down a little bit more easily under the attentions of the defending archers, but we shall have to wait and see on that one. Goblin King's Bodyguard are here also. Some Drake Broodlings, which they're a really weird kind of unit. We'll have to wait and see how they behave in a siege like this. Moving on to the player who sent me this battle replay, which is of course Winged Swordsman himself. He's playing as Rhudaur. A little bit vulnerable to missile attacks themselves, of course, but they have got some really, really nasty units, and you can't really underestimate them because they're capable of dealing damage very quickly. Maybe not with their Dunland pikemen, but pikes in general are a conundrum for the defenders to have to solve, because if too many of them are still alive in the late game, they will really struggle. Rhudaur Swordsmen are here in numbers as well. In behind them, Troubleshoot Axe Throwers. This is the kind of unit which can really do a lot of damage to defenders if they are allowed to do as they will. But they are vulnerable. They can hide anywhere, but as soon as they reveal themselves, I would expect the defenders to focus them down with arrow fire. Etenmal's Troll Hunters, Ferodrum Javelins, and Arthedain Berserkers rounding out the throwing projectile force of Rhudaur. A couple of units, actually one unit of Black Walls, one unit of Rangers, and one unit of Enslavers as well. So maybe not as much infantry as Rhudaur could bring, but as a more supporting force for more numerous Orcish armies, maybe it does make a little bit more sense. And finally we have Dunland, who have no choice really. Hunter or Hunted has to go numbers focus. Of course, it's a largely shared roster between Isengard and Rhudaur units, with a couple of unique ones as well. Half-Orc Spearguard, decently defensive unit, probably the best defensive line-holding unit Dunland can bring. This is of course the unique unit on foot that Dunland can have, the Spears of Orthanc, which are actually fantastic in melee, as well as possessing a pretty decent punch at range as well with their crossbows, so very good multifaceted unit there. The mounted version is also down here, the Riders of Orthanc. I mean, they're fantastic in melee against other cavalry, as well as being a real pain with those crossbows as well, so definitely a worthwhile bring. Dunland don't really have anything else to spend their money on after all, and it makes the sally forth from enemy cavalry much more awkward than it otherwise would be. And then some Baneguard over here that we've already seen from Isengard. The rest of the army is going to be hidden around the place as well. Now, for the defenders, we shall start off with Mevin here, who's on the outside of the settlement playing as Arthedain. Knights of Annuminus, so they could sally forth and do a lot of good damage with a cavalry unit this strong, though it is worth saying, of course, that the attackers do have many tools at their disposal to make that a little bit more difficult early. The alternative is that they could try and sequester them inside the settlement, but it's difficult to escape from OST-IN-EDHIL, so we'll see how Mevin decides to handle that. Arthedain, of course, have got access to a lot of really good bread and butter archers. The Arthedain marksmen should find themselves being very efficient in a situation like this. To be fair, didn't see that many archers from the attackers on this situation. Isengard, not many archers available to them. The Misty Mountains, Angmar, Dunland, Rhudaur, none of these factions are archer focused, so maybe not having a single faction dependent on their archers is going to bite the attacks a bit here, because it means that these units can fire with impunity into whatever they please. That includes the crossbows, of course. Dunedain Troll Slayers will be very, very important when the battle gets a little bit more close quarters in the settlement itself. 2 Illuminous Gate Guards for holding down the front line. Several Evendim Spearmen with the armour upgrade. I mean, they're cheap, as are the Arthedain Men-at-Arms generally speaking, so they can make up a decent initial front line against the lower quality units they're facing, but they're nothing too special, let's be honest. Dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights, Dunedain Peacekeepers, we have Dismounted Knights of Illuminus, another man-at-arms unit, and of course the mighty Wardens of the North. It would surprise me if there were no Rangers. They could be around here somewhere, maybe hidden in and amongst things as well. Now then, the faction that starts off in OST-IN-EDHIL itself, already fortified, is Cardolan, played by Beastie70. Of course, crossbows of their own make them a very valued member of any defence. Minotaur Roman Gatekeepers here with the armour upgrades, also with their halberds later on, could be very useful. Also going into the red limit on their upper tier pikes with the Wardens of Tyr and Gorthar, very important for keeping those Cardolan front lines in check. We've got 2 units of Dunedain Captains once again, a unit of Tharbad Warhammers, the armour piercing very useful against the Orcs, as much as the attackers will be wanting to use their armour piercing on the Arnorians. The opposite is also true. Minhiriath Spearmen, several units of Minhiriath Men-at-Arms, and there is also a unit of Minhiriath Archers over here. Could be a few hidden units here and there as well. Cardolan do have access to a fair few of those after all. And then finally, of course, playing very much on home turf, Proxima Centuri commanding Imladris. Got some Archers of Rivendell over here, Noritino Warriors, Eldarin Archers, and some upgraded Godhelm, so the full array of Imladris Archers. While they may be the least archer-focused Elven faction, that doesn't mean they're bad with their archers by any means, as the attackers will find out, I'm sure. Swords of Rivendell, Broinen River Wards, 2 units of Imladris Sentry, so again, double pikes, double quality pikes on this occasion as well, so definitely going to be an interesting one in terms of the Phalanx War in this particular battle. 2 units of Guardians, a couple of units of... yeah, 2 units of Spears, 1 unit of the Swordmasters, the Gwythi Arthad and the Gwythi Rhudaur. Nothing too surprising there, but maybe a little bit more surprising is the investment in this much cavalry. I mean, Gwythi Rhudaur combined with the Arthedain Knights on the other side could be a real problem for the attackers to have to deal with. 2 units of Riders of the Broinen can also harass the attackers on the way forward and later can be used as makeshift shock cavalry as well. But of course, the attackers still have to make their way up the hill, or the defenders can make their way down the hill with their own cavalry. We shall wait and see, but we shall make a cut before that happens, and I shall see you on the other side. So a little bit of an asymmetric assault to start things off here, as some of the forces, being Dunland, are still quite a long way away from being able to pressurise the rear of the ruins, but that isn't going to stop the other forces from trying to open up a bit of a skirmish fight here. Now, to be honest, this is the sort of fight where the Minhiriath Archers are going to be very comfortable against Rhudaur Marksmen. They have the terrain advantage and they're just better in a skirmish fight in general. But, like I said, this is the kind of battlefield where none of the attacking armies are really going to have what it takes to really go for that long-term skirmishing fight and actually come out victorious here for the attackers. So victory for them is going to have to come through a swift melee assault. Now, this is a little bit risky, Isengard being so bunched up like this, but they're preparing the ground ready for an assault on the Imladris side of this defence. Now, Imladris should do pretty well against the majority of Isengard units, but then that's kind of true when it comes to an infantry fight with any of the attacking factions today. Imladris are just on a different level when it comes to their quality after all. Cave Trolls coming forward, menacing the front line. That is Minhiriath Sharpshooters, and I think they are going after actually trying to shoot some of the Cave Trolls. You can see them being bloodied up a little bit. Personally, I don't see the benefit to shooting trolls like this with javelins. You can up close because they're big targets and many of the javelins will hit, and of course they do a lot of damage very, very quickly. But I think crossbows, you're better off going after more concentrated blobs of upper end infantry if you're able, because too many of those bolts are going to miss, especially based on the way that they're having to bank their shots there. Well, the Knights of Illuminus were going to think about sallying out there, but I mean the problem with that is if they do have to retreat in a hurry, their own stakes are going to get in the way, so I can certainly understand why they actually pulled back from that. 2 entrances from the front, 1 entrance on the side and 1 entrance on the rear, so 4 potential ways into the settlement here. All 4 of them need to be utilised if the attackers are to get the most out of their numbers here, especially given that a lot of these entrances and exits are pretty narrow for infantry, as mentioned in the deployment phase. a lot of these. There's Tharvad Riders and Royal Court of House Rhudaur as well that were missed in the composition phase. I mean, both of them very good off the charge. But Tharvad Riders is a little bit fragile still. Plenty of defending cavalry. They can be used well. And there is a case for saying that all of this cavalry at this point in proceedings maybe should be looking to harass Dunland as they take the very long way around the settlement. Hearthguard of Amon Sul is shooting. That's an example of a unit being left on fire at will from Misty 70, because there's no way he'd be shooting with an angle such as that. Heavy Goblin Spears taking cover once again, ready to potentially move up. Again, the Knights of Idumnus thinking about charging down here, but the presence of so many of these armor-piercing spears is really a sign that shouldn't be your first thought. Obviously, depleted archers like this, I can see why Flaming Shot maybe is being utilised, but I don't know, I still think you're fairly unlikely to actually rout any of these Rhudaur units. In the background there you can see some Cardolan nobles revealing themselves from hiding as well, so attacking cavalry. I mean, Cardolan nobles armour piercing is all well and good, but we have seen in the bracket fight between lance cavalry that it's not enough to really make up for the sheer heft that a unit like the Knights of Idumnus is going to bring. That was a rather limp charge, however, and indeed none of the heavy goblin spears actually fell. It wasn't really a charge, to be fair, it was more just sort of bumping into the enemy. Angmar marauders coming up to help reinforce the heavy goblin spears position here. It's really not a happy hunting ground this for the Knights of Idumnus. The spears are there, they'll get bogged down in and amongst trolls. There's plenty of infantry in behind to make it so they can't smash through and then carry on into the rear lines of the enemy. I think they have sort of, the die is cast, as it were, for using the cavalry later in the fight at this point rather than trying to use them now, because the settlement, especially in the earlier stages of the attack here, is going to be largely surrounded by infantry. You're going to have to wait for a gap, I think. Maybe here in the backfield, like I mentioned, you could get a little bit more out of your cavalry. Meanwhile, what have we here? Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the Dunlanding clansmen, technically speaking, are very good against cavalry like this. You can see actually the Gwythi Rhudaur do have some losses and some units bloodied up. Definitely not a worthwhile trade to lose any riders at the hands of these Dunlanders, but that's what Isengard are pretty good at. You can see they have been taking consistent charges. This one unit could end up being completely destroyed. Some heavy goblins, some Uruk-hai crossbowmen also in support, which is perhaps why more of the Gwythi Rhudaur have fallen as well. I mean, the Dunlanding clansmen, the first melee engagement really happening in this battle, but it's Isengard throwing some of their militia units very much under the bus, because there's no way they're going to be able to defeat Swords of Rivendell in melee. Exactly the kind of foe that these more lightly armoured denizens of Imladris will very much enjoy fighting. Elsewhere, still not an engagement happening in earnest over here. I mean, there really isn't any full engagements happening as of right now. You can see the Dunlanders now being introduced to the Cardolan cavalry as they do charge downhill. Cardolan nobles are going to be able to defeat Royal Court of House Rhudaur in melee, though. This is where their status as knights and those armour-piercing morning stars they will come in very, very handy against the Royal Court. You can see here that actually the Tharvad riders getting utterly demolished really by the advancing Great Broodling. So some Rhudaur and Misty Mountain support providing the protection to the Dunland infantry that was needed, and a bit of a disastrous foray into enemy territory with their cavalry here for Cardolan, turning around because I think they realise they're not actually going to escape the Cardolan nobles like this, so having to turn around and take the forced engagement. Not great from their perspective. They are going to retreat. There's also, of course, the Riders of Orthanc, which will prove to be a bit of a problem, but yeah, I think at this point, save as many of those Royal Court as you can, get them into your territory, and use them alongside other cavalry as and where you can. But I mentioned earlier on that maybe the defending cavalry could prove to be a very significant part of this battle, and so far, I mean, the Gwythi Rhudaur they've got kills, but it's not really on anything too impressive. And we've seen the Cardolan cavalry given a real beating. I mean, there are some powerful Baneguard on the front line now helping out the Swords of Rivendell, which they at least, well, helping out the Dunlanding clansmen against the Swords of Rivendell. They at the very least will be better in this engagement, but exposed to the Gwythi Rhudaur, this is still going to be a relatively easy opening defence here for Imladris, albeit they are slowly losing riders. Riders of the Bruinen are over here as well. Lots of the archers are targeting down the Uruk-hai pikemen as well. As you can see, their armour will help them somewhat, but a very good choice of target here by the elves. Meanwhile, still not keen on going all in for a frontal assault just yet. Angmar, the Misty Mountains and Rhudaur are going to have most of their troops over here. I mean, there are 2 choke points, that's understandable, but they do need to... maybe they are just purely waiting for the Dunlanders to start doing the business back here as well. Meanwhile, further over here, archers of Rivendell having to bank their shots a little bit, but because it is into the Uruk-hai pikemen, I do think it is worth it, and you can see actually because of the elven accuracy, not many of those shots are going astray. Half-Orc Baneguard having already been depleted heavily by the charges from the Gwaithir Rhudaur. Taking losses, but still the attacking announcer feeling confident about their chances in a 5v3. That's only natural. Cardolan nobles are back over here now though. I mean, they are fairly depleted from their exertions already, but killing off a few more riders of the Bruinen, but with the Gwaithir Rhudaur in close attendance, the riders also more than capable of actually defending themselves. I imagine this is probably going to be the end of the Rhudaur cavalry, but they've already done quite well. They've already blunted the defending cavalry force decently enough, and their usefulness in the settlement itself is going to be somewhat limited. Attacking cavalry is always good in transitional phases, but as I mentioned, this settlement isn't really one that throws up a lot of transitional phases when the initial defences fall. That's more a sign the attacks are just going to go on to straight up win rather than anything else. Meanwhile, Rhudaur are actually the ones leading the way here as a combination of the heavy cavalry of both Arthedain and Cardolan smash into their distant Arnorian cousins, and then there's also heavy goblin infantry in here as well. As the cavalry retreats from the initial assault, I mean this is more of a full-blooded assault, you'd have to say, than the one Isengard has mounted on the Imladris position. All 3 of the attacking armies over here sending forward infantry units, but it's all 3 of their most basic ones, so I don't really know how much leeway they're going to get. I mean, there's a very depleted unit of Trollshaw axe throwers trying to deplete more of that cavalry, but you can see here as well, Minhiriath Archers in a good position to utilise Flaming Shot, and they may very well end up breaking this initial assault here, so it's not the worst idea in the world. They're taking a few throwing axes, but again, I don't think that will concern them too greatly. Pikes moving in to help anchor this front line in place, Greenway Garrison footmen, so I think the defenders will be quite pleased with their line building so far, and they should be okay for the time being. Also an attack going on over here, this time with the cave trolls though, but maybe a little bit too early on the cave trolls. Front line's still a bit too thick for them to push through. I mean, they're going to do damage to the unit of pikes that are over here. Having said that, with Tharbad Warhammers on the way, they will melt away the cave trolls pretty quickly. This is maybe a sign as well that Dunland do need to hurry up. It took a very long way around to get to the rear end of the settlement, and they will also need to start pressurising the defenders as well. Unison in the attack is very important. Another unit of pikes is an interesting choice, given it is currently trolls on the front line, but maybe you're counting on the fact they're going to melt away pretty quickly, and your line will be ready to withstand what comes. Swords of Rivendell now taking a lot of losses. Uruk-hai pikemen being committed forward, having already taken a lot of hits, and another unit of Half-Orc Baneguard as well. Maybe a little bit late here on the uptake here with the Elder Enway Spearmen, but at the very least it will stop Isengard from pushing further on. But I don't think you needed to lose all of that unit of Swords of Rivendell before you committed reinforcements. I think an earlier committal of this unit of Elder Enway Spearmen would have been what's called for. Very depleted Uruk-hai crossbows, but even a depleted unit such as this, if left unchecked, can rack up an impressive kill count for itself as the game goes along. Hits into the Archers of Rivendell. Riders of Orthanc here as well though, so yet more crossbow action. Maybe this is why he didn't commit the unit, but if that's the case then he shouldn't have committed them at all. I think the awkward in-between there, as I've often referred to it, doing not enough of either extreme, and that will play into the hands of the attackers. More of their numerous units continuing to collide with this front line, and now that the trolls are gone, this is where the double pike line, including a unit of higher tier pikes, will come in very handy. Of course, the Tharbad Warhammers on the front line will absolutely dominate, especially with all the support they're getting against these highly basic units of orcs. So they'll be very pleased with how this has gone so far. Over here, meanwhile, actually being pushed back off the front line entirely, perhaps as the result of a rout from the flaming arrows. And now the cavalry is once again able to charge into and try and soften up the waves of orcs. Need to be careful though, because their own stakes can prove to be a bit of a problem. Maybe they already have been an issue, but still this one unit of Minhiriath archers probably achieving a fairly decent kill count for itself. It does look as though there are still cave trolls down there, so they were actually retreated rather than killed, which is a good thing for the attackers. They can use their cave trolls a little later when the front lines are feeling a little bit more fatigued. Dunland, meanwhile, opening up with a little bit of skirmishing. Again, I'm not really sure of the overall merits of this. I mean, the Guathlo trackers banking their shots over. This is the problem with this settlement, but it looks like they're going after Dunedain peacekeepers. I don't know. I don't feel as though the damage here is going to be all that worthwhile. Your allies are already throwing themselves into melee. Even if it's just a token effort, some very low tier units, you should at least start probing the front line, I think. Meanwhile, Tunevelda Runaway Spearmen still getting bullied a little bit by the Riders of Orthanc. Out of ammunition archers have driven down. I mean, they are... It's enough to sort of turn back the reinforcements that were initially committed, I suppose, but for Isengard, all they need to do now is keep shooting from afar, and they will get the more efficient end of that engagement, Uruk-hai Berserkers. Also, the good thing about Isengard being over here is their reinforcements are not too far away. Their entire army's reinforcements are not too far away, so that's the benefit of having your units blobbed up like this. No artillery will be able to reach you either, so it's actually good sort of stacking up, as it were, by Isengard. It means that if necessary they can go into all-out attack mode much more easily. It's harder to do that over here because you'll need to commit them to one of two directions. Speaking of which though, still this little fight is not going that well for the attackers, as you'd imagine. Plenty of them routing, plenty of them dying at the hands of a unit like the Tharbad Warhammers. They're actually going to pull themselves off the front line now though. Not needed anymore, especially with this wave completely falling apart really, and 79 heavy goblin infantry is not going to be enough to turn that around. But a double pike block, there's a few Minhiriath men-at-arms still remaining as well. And then also, if need be, some Arthedain archers to help the defensive line as well. Cave trolls getting ready to attack over here. A healthier unit of Trollshore Axe throwers trying to do some damage to the firing lines of the defenders over here, and given that it is Minhiriath sharpshooters, that is very understandable. Cave trolls coming in, but again this is a very well prepared front line, so as much as a lot of these units are not going to be that great at dealing damage to trolls quickly, the cave trolls are not going to be able to push through in the way that Misty Mountains players will often want them to. Greenway Garrison footmen here in force. I mean, it was kind of a pike-to-pike engagement with the Dunland pikemen on the front line here as well, but I don't know. Of course, the ranged units on both sides will be hoping to be as efficient as possible. Extremely necessary for the defenders to have this mindset. So this defeat seems certain for them, so I mean the cave trolls are doing a lot of damage here to this Cardolan-led front line. Cardolan leading the infantry front lines on both of these frontal choke points. We'll see how that situation develops. Dunland getting ready perhaps to try and pressure the front line with some Trollshore Axe throwers moving forward in a menacing fashion. They are going to throw a volley here. Evandim spears. Again, is this really a worthwhile use of a unit that can be as deadly as Axe throwers? I mean, considering they have the natural advantage, maybe it is. Just any kills they can get are going to prove to be a real problem for the defenders later on. They need as much of their manpower still alive as humanly possible. Northguard of Amon-Sul. Isengard committing forward yet more reinforcements. Gwythi Rhudaur trying to You can see over here Dunland actually sending over some help for Isengard of all things. I mean, the Riders of Orthanc almost completely gone, which is actually a little bit of a shame. It's a sign that they've lingered too long in the crosshairs of the Elven Archers. Isengard forces. Still the Elder Runway Spearmen showing their expertise. I think this is a second unit of theirs committed, however. This cavalry, I'm not sure whether it has paid for itself ultimately. I mean, it has, over time, in spite of taking fairly consistent damage, built up a kill count for itself, I suppose, against decent units, but kind of hard to tell. I guess the overall outcome of the battle will help colour perceptions in that regard. There is a gap here that infantry could be utilising if they wanted to push forward a little bit more aggressively. Maybe that's what the Drake Broodlings were thinking of doing before they then doubled back. Barrow Wights on the way forward, that's always quite a menacing sign to see. Angmar, very capable of keeping assaults going for extremely long periods of time with Barrow Wights, but they are better when they are fighting alongside something else. I mean, a unit of battered heavy goblin infantry is maybe not the sort of heavy duty assault the Barrow Wights are used to being a part of, being an Angmar unit. Still this front line looking pretty solid for the time being. Meanwhile, Cave Trolls, were they retreated again or did they die this time? It looks like they did perish. And they would have gotten a fair amount of kills against units like this on the front line. There are Dunland captains though, which maybe they were committed to the front line with the purpose of trying to bring down the trolls as quickly as possible. It would be worthwhile. Snarger skirmishers are there. Now marksmen continuing to try and do damage to the ranged units here in response. I mean, this is the problem that the attackers are facing on this choke point, is that as they move forward and commit more units to the front line, they are continuing to take a fairly hefty amount of damage. Especially from those crossbows. I mean, there's nothing on the front line which is too important on an individual unit basis to the attackers here, but so far, the Cardolan infantry front lines at the front of the ruins have proven to be fairly solid indeed. Meanwhile, a bit of a wide front line this. Dunland could make use of this if they're willing to be hyper-aggressive, but I don't think they are based on how Hunter or Hunted has set its table early on. Powerful Bane Guard again individually. Probably be fairly efficient actually against a lot of Arthedain units, maybe not against the Dunland, but against the rank and file, yes. They're taking charges from what remains of the Knights of Luminous, though. They're taking fire arrows to the rear, so I can't imagine, morale-wise, they're going to hold up for all that long, if we're being honest. We see Cern again, Arthedain men-at-arms moving forward, helping to reinforce the front line. So far, only the most basic of Arthedain infantry units have seen combat, which is a good sign for them later on. I mean, I have to say, considering the amount of frames left, I imagine at some stage the attackers are going to shift to going a little bit more all-in, which could work out quite well for them. We've seen that happen in the past, or it could make them fall apart depending on how well the defenders are able to respond to that. Guathlo trackers are still the Drake Broodlings running around as well. Not a hugely comprehensive infantry force waiting for Imladris there. If Isengard were to shift to being very aggressive very quickly. Wardens of Gorthar fighting on the front line, keeping these units at bay. Heavy Goblin Spears now moving forward to help the Barrow Wights out, as well as a unit of Guardians of Cardolan. This is a little bit more like it. Maybe a mass pushing unit over here, followed up by a full-blooded assault, would be the answer. I'm not sure. Heavy Goblin Infantry are there. Heavy Goblin Crossbows providing support. This is the sort of thing which we can't really account for. Like, as much as the infantry engagements have been going in the favour of the defenders for the time being, this is a very good position for these Heavy Goblin Crossbows, because they do have a fairly clear shot. This is the sort of thing which, come the late game, we could suddenly see the defenders losing ground very quickly because of the damage that has built up over time from situations like that. Snarger Skirmish is also a unit which can contribute to that sort of thing. Rhudaur Marksman in attendance as well. And it's looking like the Guardians of Cardolan arriving on the front line has made this particular assault look a little bit more even, certainly taking on more of an even look to it now. Here we have sharpshooters right there. Just in behind. Still a bit of cavalry from the Royal Court of House of the Wanderer. I mean, reinforcements are available for Cardolan on this front line should they need it, and I think they will need it with a very significant next wave coming in. Dunland pikemen will help shore things up. The Blackwatch Legion here as well, so maybe this is the moment. Maybe this is the starting gun, as it were, for the attackers to start really trying to turn the screw on the settlement as a whole. If they really start gaining ground over here, a pike-based defence is of course exactly the sort of thing the Blackwatch Legion will be good at dismantling. Short axe throwers are here in position. Dunland yet to really throw in against what is a primarily Arthedain defence back here. Doing some decent damage here with their short axe throwers again. It's incremental, but it's the sort of thing which can really build up over time. And that's how attackers can afford to operate in a 5v3. Well, this is going to be a fairly key moment, I think. Angmar moving in with their Blackwatch Legion. Rhudaur working in tandem with them as well, pushing a unit of Rhudaur swordsmen forward to try and help consolidate any gains that are made, with the pikes also anchoring the initial line as well. Counter-attacks are much more difficult for the defenders, and I don't think the defenders are all that prepared for this. I don't think they're even paying attention to it, really. And by the time they do, it may already be too late. Dunland captain's already looking a little bit scattered. The Blackwatch Legion a little bit tankier individually than the Mordor equivalent, the Blackguard Barad-dûr. Unit Troll Slayers being engaged in melee. Again, a unit of high-tier crossbows and javelins being engaged in melee before they can truly use up any of their ammunition is also another big win for the attackers. They may have to then, deal with Troll Slayers in melee, which doesn't seem great for them, but it's even worse for you if they're allowed to use their javelins first and foremost. Trying to use them at point blank here. It could end up routing here, and more reinforcements are needed to flood in. Some more Trollhunts and Guardians of Khârn Dûn. Still a bit of a precarious situation for the attackers. As long as they continue to commit reinforcements forward, which it does look as though they're intending on doing, they can certainly make this work for them. This attack over here on this side, all it needs to do, I think, is just keep going, which, considering its main component is Barrow-wights, I don't think that will prove to be too much of a concern. Elsewhere, this attack completely stopping, which is rarely a good thing for the attackers, but Isengard, all they need to do is see which way the wind is blowing on the other sides of the settlements, and then they can move in force. And I think this is where, again, Drake Broodling's in amongst things. This is dangerous moments here for the defenders. Drake Broodlings in amongst your backlines is definitely not what you need. Not really a great deal else happening though. Dunland maybe still being a little bit overcautious. I think both Dunland and Isengard can afford to start pushing in as well, because if they don't, more reinforcements could afford to be siphoned off over here, which, as we've mentioned already, is the key engagement really, as it stands. And here we have sharpshooters. And come the Trolls of Angmar as well. A little bit more built for this sort of thing than the cave trolls we saw earlier on. In spite of that, there are some units of aggressive infantry which will be fairly good at dealing with trolls, but given the overall situation now, a little bit more chaotic. This is certainly still the sort of thing the defenders can recover from though, if the attackers do not double down on their aggressive tendencies that we've seen. Any reinforcements? Hammer Guard. Still quite a few units that are a little bit far away from my liking, but they are mobilising themselves now, trying to get closer to the front lines. God Halim. Half-Orc Spearguard on the way forwards. Dunland's committing forward a few more infantry units now. Pressure being turned up, but the defender's not buckling under it just yet. Drake Broodlings, I think, have either retreated or perished. Kind of hard to tell, they can move pretty quickly. Dunland Peacekeepers moving down the hill, making up this front line. Half-Orc Spearguard, as we mentioned, a fairly good defensive unit. There's also some Baneguard in there as well, so good attack and defence, but Dunland Peacekeepers with support would be enough to deal with these half-orcs, but for the moment, reinforcements I think are more necessary over here. If they can turn back the tide of the attackers over here, without the defenders making any inroads on other choke points first, they will feel very confident about their chances moving forward here, the defenders. And you can see Arthedain, because Dunland are not really willing to push forward in numbers, Arthedain committing more reinforcements over here and helping to at least try and turn the tide. I mean, the problem that they do have though is a little bit of a flanking force from Rhudaur moving over here, overlapping the front lines, still momentum in the attackers' favour for the time being, and with stuff like Hammerguard on the way forward, I think they see the necessity of keeping the momentum over here. If they do allow themselves to start getting pushed back over here, it will be pretty bad for them. Pair of Whites. This front line's still fairly comfortable for the defenders, but I mean, they're not going to be able to get rid of the Barrow Whites quickly. Heavy Goblin Infantry, a very different matter of course, given that it is Dunland captains that they're having to deal with. Fairly easy for them. Isengard now pushing forward. Godhelm shooting into the Trolls. Trolls of the White Hand are here. Archer and Rhudaur blocking their approach. I don't think you can send the Trolls flying by the looks of things with the Godhelm ammunition. And between them and the Arthedain, the Trolls on their own without support are going to really struggle, but some of the Imladris units that have been left behind here, just the two units as I mentioned, something we saw Proxima Centauri doing in the last battle with Numenor was leaving defences like this in gaps available. Ultimately, of course, a narrow victory for the defenders on that occasion, but will he be punished for it this time, especially given the precious nature of a unit like the Arthedain late on? Orotino warriors shooting in. A good answer perhaps for the Uruk-hai pikemen. Any damage done to the Uruk-hai infantry is not a bad thing either, but still a little bit chaotic. I mean, Isengard, the mistake I think Isengard are making, honestly, is they're not being aggressive enough. Like, they're sending forward units, but they're not really punishing the gaps as they could, which is a little bit of a shame. Trolls of the White Hand trying to get into the backfield here, but they are going to be stopped, and with this level of Elven opposition, even the Trolls of the White Hand, one of the very best units of Trolls in the game, are going to fall away. And I don't really know if we're in the final phase of this battle yet or not. But if the attackers do go on to lose this, I feel as though it will be a result of all of them not singing from the same hymn sheet, as it were. Isengard and Dunland a little bit too standoffish in comparison to their very aggressive allies here on the front. Forward come the Anuminas Gate Guards, Arthedain Men-at-Arms. Gatekeepers are here as well. Troll Slayers moving in. And they'll be pretty good against pretty much everything over here, to be honest with you, but they will also be, I would imagine, a target of enemy attentions. Archers all over the place. A Dunland moving in now. I mean, kind of, I guess. More of their infantry being committed in, but Arthedain able to simply plug the gap with more infantry of their own. More Spear Guard. Probably need to start shooting in, because these Snaga skirmishers, maybe Arthedain having to commit forward so much of in the way of reinforcements over here, will pay dividends for Dunland eventually. I think they kind of missed the boat a little bit on when it would have been most effective, but as long as Dunland does start being a little bit more aggressive from now, that will be probably, it'll be either the Cardolan or the Arthedain general, I would imagine, so I think the Imladris one will still be over here. Some Uruk-hai infantry pushing up the hill, having their progress blocked. Still clarified, there are still some Drake Broodlings left alive. Not many of them though, and they won't want to stick around in melee against Arthedain. Charging off to try and deal with Norotino warriors, more of the Uruk-hai over here to maintain this assault against this Imladris infantry. Orthanc pikemen. Further back, Elder Runway archers. Continuing to shoot in to Isengard. Mountains. I don't know if they've used up their ammunition yet, but they could be another real danger for the defenders. The defenders, though, still fairly stable, you'd have to say, over here, and the Dunland Rangers in melee is a sign that they've used up ammunition, which, given the amount of destruction which has occurred over here, is not too surprising, but still units like Witchround Blackguard moving in, still reinforcements as well, numerous reinforcements from the Misty Mountains, but Witchround Pikemen having to be committed and getting shot at point-blank range by enemy archers, not exactly great for them, and like I said, losing this fight, given how much they've committed to it, is not necessarily a game ender, but it requires your allies to be making good progress elsewhere, and I feel as though that is ultimately not the case. Nevin making very good use of his basic archers here on multiple fronts. I imagine the Arthedain marksmen will end this battle with a fairly healthy kill count for themselves. Just about to Fornoster Rhine Knights moving in to help really turn the screw on the half-orcs. This is where Dunland's lack of quality could come back to haunt them a little bit. Norotuna Warriors, can Isengard begin punishing? With the Dunlander support they're getting, can they begin doing the business? I mean, I think in Imladris they are now a little bit more organised in the sense they've got more of a defensive line here. They're being funnelled uphill into the elites of the elves. Godhelene taking hits from the Spears of Orthanc, which is obviously not great for them, but something they can respond to in kind. Indeed, I think that is what they are doing with their Elder Runway Archers. What remains of the Tharbad Warhammers are still here, 18 of them. Now going up against the more heavily armoured Uruk-hai, something else they'll be efficient against, and obviously alongside the Elven unit of a similar class. Most of the Barrow-wights at this point gone. Looks like they're having to renew an assault over here, the attackers, which is a bit of a worrying sign. And again, as we have a look at the kill counts here, they are 9% behind the attackers. The announcer still fancies their chances, but let's not forget as well, that doesn't take into account routing units, which I imagine there's going to be plenty of for the attackers, so that gap may actually be wider than it appears. But the attackers, more margin for error than the defenders. All it takes is for one shift in the momentum in the late game towards the attackers, and the defenders probably won't be able to recover from it. Ferodran Javelins moving in to help fight on the front line. They'll be a pretty good answer to the dismounted Knights of Adunas, especially with how depleted they already are. Heavy Goblin Infantry. Witchround Enslavers. Victory seems certain, and the Fool could lose this battle. I mean, yeah, wrapping around with a unit of that quality, maybe they are finally going to have a good time of things over on this side, but armour-piercing arrows from the Wardens of the North, Dunedain Troll Slayers could also fire in. They're actually going after something else. They're going after the Witches, which is wise. I mean, one volley from the Witches, which is effective, would be a devastating blow at this point. What remains of those Imladris sentries, and now the Troll Slayers getting hit by the Franodyne Berserkers and their throwing axes. Nasty, nasty projectiles there. The Witches trying to get in position. Angmar, last time we saw the battle actually ended up very close, and that was largely as a result of Angmar actually recovering for the attackers with the Witches. They weren't able to go on to win as a result of that. The Witches still trying to get into place. Arthedain marksmen and more Arthedain men-at-arms that are out of ammunition being committed to the front line. Big show of strength here from the attackers. If they can, again, Franodyne Rangers in a good position, so Rhudaur and Angmar with their skirmishers could be the reason why they do still go on to win this. Spears of Orthanc, another unit of them. I mean, the Dunland assault here on this choke point is completely fallen apart, so Arthedain can now commit all of their resources, bar one really, to keep that one unit of Spears of Orthanc in check. The second unit of them is over here, taking hits from the Godhelene. This is where their very heavily armoured nature will help them, but they will still find it a little bit difficult to get set, given the nature of the projectile that they utilise, the Godhelene. Uruk-hai Berserkers moving up. Again, on their own like this, they aren't really going to be as effective. But you can see here, this front line is now collapsed. Big push here from the Misty Mountains, actually, with a depleted front line. The Misty Mountains have now swamped forward, and this may be the moment where we see the defenders' efforts fall apart. They've done very well to withstand these large-scale assaults. Heavy Goblin Halberds actually pulling back. That's a risky move from Vic, because a lot of these heavy goblins could end up routing if you do this. I think he's just trying to give a little bit more room for his Snaga skirmishers to do their thing. Sentries on the way over. Berserkers. Still a lot of these missiles could end up proving to be a bit of a difference maker, with Elder Runway archers in melee alongside sentries, but Goblin King's bodyguard are over here. They've got support from halberds and javelins, so I don't think the attackers will be too concerned. The Witchhound Blackguard are in the backfield now, mopping up what remains of these Troll Slayers. Yeah, it's getting a little bit more difficult to see a recovery. There are the Witchers coming back again. Victory finally for the attackers here, but it's cost them a great deal, but it's looking like it may prove to be worthwhile in the long run. Brandwein Berserkers, Blackwolds. They've got a fair few units left, the attackers, which are of decent quality, whereas I think the defenders have had to commit their quality units earlier to keep things in check. And that may end up proving to be fairly significant. And yeah, you can see very, very quickly actually, they went from 9 percentage points behind to 2 percentage points ahead, the attackers, and I think that level of momentum shift is not the sort of thing the defenders are going to be able to recover from, sadly enough. It was always a potential problem. I mean, they left it fairly late to really commit in a big way to other front lines other than this one. But they did so just enough, and it's looking now like all of the defenders' efforts will be in vain. We saw last time the defenders able to squeak out a victory on the Old Forest Road, but I don't think that's going to be the case here in OST-IN-EDHIL. Further down the hill, Nazkai now moving forward. I think this is pretty much the last of Isengard's units. The Godhalim are finishing off the Spears of Orthanc, but the Nazkai will do the same to them in turn. So yeah, Isengard's army is honestly fairly depleted, you'd have to say. They will probably still be standing by the time the battle is over though. The Misty Mountains still with a fair few individual goblins running around, but of course it makes up a fairly tiny proportion of what their army was initially. But I think you've seen the merits of having a numbers focused army here, as displayed by the Misty Mountains. Is it indeed? Heavy Gobbo Spears. Witchhound Blackguard on the way across. I mean, you can see here Warns of the North are very effective, certainly more effective than Rhudaur Rangers ever will be in melee. Snaga Skirmisher is going to surround them though. The Witchhound Blackguard moving forward. Spears of Orthanc. Yeah, I think at this point it's fairly clear to see the attackers will be victorious. Actually some green smoke. So the Witchers in the end, I mean, to be fair, the Witchers haven't really been too decisive in this battle. I think the defenders actually have stopped them for the most part, and at this point the battle of course is already somewhat lost. It will be within 10% though. It has been close as well. I mean, for a large period, especially in the mid-game, it was looking like the attackers would burn themselves out on the defending front lines, but in the end their numbers were enough. Some very numbers focused factions here. It does go to show as well how difficult OST-IN-EDHIL is to defend, because under normal circumstances you could retreat. If you knew you were going to be pressured too much, you could retreat, try and limit the damage on the transitional phase and retreat to better ground. That's not an option in OST-IN-EDHIL. If you retreat to the middle of the settlement, you're actually making your life harder. So it is a very difficult map to defend, especially against a force as numerous as this one. So I'm not too surprised in the end that the attackers have won this, but the defenders made a good fist of it. Better maybe than I thought they would. Defeat seems certain for the Broinen River Wards. Isengard finally gaining the upper hand over here as well. Again, maybe not as cautious as Dunland, but Isengard still were very cautious. It hasn't proven to be too much of a problem in the end. The attackers just about in tandem with one another enough to seize control of things here late on. Eight Godhalim remain. The Misty Mountains doing their best to finish off the Imladris units over here. I mean, Gwaithir-Myrdain, even as depleted as they are, will be difficult. There goes the... No, that's the Dunland general, actually. They use the same model, so it's a little confusing, but the Dunland general does fall. See the tridents of the enslavers over there as well, so it's entirely possible. In fact, there is the Rhudaur general, also putting himself in harm's way against the Wardens of the North, but overwhelming force is being applied. It is, you know, considering we've got what, 12% of the attacking force as it remains. But bear in mind that also some of the attackers will have routed, so this is probably more along the lines of 8 or 9%. And it still looks fairly impressive, but that's because, again, of the numbers-focused approach, which is why I always sort of espouse the merits of such an approach for the attackers. Like, not all the armies, of course, 1 or 2 quality-focused in a 5v3, but I think at least 2 of the armies, if you go numbers-heavy, which Dunland, of course, have to, there's no real option. The Misty Mountains, of course, very likely to do the same. Angmar on this occasion also. I think it really makes the defenders' job more difficult than it is if you've got smaller but more high quality armies, because it's easier for the defenders to deal with a smaller army because they can then allocate their resources more easily, and they're always going to have individually more high quality units than you in a situation like this. Which is why I think you really need to play into something that you will always have the edge in, and that is of course numbers. And there we have it. Victory for the attackers. I think well earned in the end as well. I think it was a very... I mean, obviously a very gutsy push. It was always going to be fairly costly, but there was no real getting around that. And I do feel like in the end they have been rewarded for that. I don't know if there's much else the defenders could have done. I think one thing that we did mention earlier on is, given the fact that the defenders did have cavalry, 4 units in all 3 of them bringing them, and some expensive examples of which in there as well, I don't really think the cavalry, any one of them, fully paid for itself, and that's a big problem. Like, you need to be doing better, I think, with your cavalry. I think on a map like this, because it's very difficult to escape the settlements in the late game, by the time you can, very often, the battle could have already completely swung against you, as we saw here, once gaps were starting to appear in the back line, for example, with Dunland's assault. It was already a little bit too late for the defenders on the front, so I feel as though having to get your cavalry out into the open field a little bit quicker was probably the way they had to do things. With stuff like the Riders of Orthanc, Cardolan Nobles, Drake Broodlings even, it would always have been quite annoying to use your cavalry, but that's the risk you bring when you have cavalry as the defenders. You kind of need to assume that the attackers are going to try and counteract it in some way, shape or form. So yeah, I mean, it is what it is from that perspective. That's maybe the thing I would have said, maybe composition-wise, remove the cavalry, or use the cavalry in a different manner than they did here. I think infantry-wise and skirmisher-wise, there's not much else the defenders could have done, to be honest with you. But still, the cavalry did make up, certainly financially, a fairly decent portion of their army, and I don't think it was all that worthwhile. Attackers, like I mentioned, I think they reaped the rewards of an aggressive push, and then on the other fronts, it was either a red herring like the Dunland one at the back, or over here the Misty Mountains did push forward aggressively eventually, and so did Isengard, and that was obviously what really turned the battle against the defenders from a position they could then not really recover from. All of the attackers did quite well in filling their roles as well, I feel. Let's see what did the damage for the Rhudaur army. Winged Swordsman, the player sent me the replay. The Enslavers, Berserkers and Javelins, I mean, we saw earlier on when those 3 units were committed, that was when they were really turning the screw on the big assault they were mounting. And used very well. I think in particular the Cardolan Berserkers going after Imladris sentries and Dunland Troll Slayers. Lots of good kills there, and then obviously some more in melee later on. Reforged Javelins also doing quite well in melee. Very often we actually see them be maybe a little bit underwhelming considering the kind of unit they are in melee, but then very often it's kind of a weird one. But yeah, the Reforged Javelins doing well at range and in melee. Blackwald's doing nicely. Several units not doing quite so well, but then of course this was in the earlier stages of the battle, also in the more costly phases of the battle for the attackers, which is always going to be something which ultimately happens. So yeah, a good battle that. So yeah, big thank you to Winged Swordsman 44 for sending this replay in. I've got a few more from him as well, which I will be doing, although I'm coming to the end of this particular recording session, and then I may be going away for work next week. I'm not entirely certain on that point yet. We'll just have to wait and see. As for future replays, and by the time I come back, hopefully I can do another bracket style video. Also, there is the looming spectre of that live stream update, although yesterday, as of yesterday when I recorded a replay, at the end of one of them you may notice that I mentioned that later on in the year is a little bit more concrete. As of today, things have become a lot more uncertain again, unfortunately. So maybe I will delay that live stream update if by June I still don't know what's going on. Very frustrating though. My life is a little bit complicated to try and follow at this point in time, but hopefully by the time summer is through, everything will be a little bit more concrete. And yeah, I mean, from the channel's perspective, regardless of what happens, you probably won't notice a great deal of negative change. Hopefully if there is change, it will be positive, but who knows. I mean, that's the sort of thing which, again, I will let people know about later on in the summer when I actually have actual concrete news rather than the fake concrete news that I seem to have had. But yeah, it is what it is. That's something which we can talk about at a later date, not wedged at the end of one of these replays. The next replay that you'll see is probably going to be, I mean, it was sent to me by the Womb Raider on Minas Falath. I think it was actually also sent to me by Winged Swordsman 44. Irregardless of that, that's probably going to be the next replay that you see, following my return maybe, unless I can maybe squeeze in recording one after work tomorrow before I get sent away. I don't know, we'll have to wait and see. If there is a little gap in the usual schedule, which there may be, because I think at this point I'm 2.5 weeks ahead of schedule, whereas if I get sent away for the full 3 weeks, that of course means there will be a 1 video gap, I believe. If that is the case, then I will communicate that, but we shall see. We shall see. Anyway, big thank you to Winged Swordsman 44 once again. Big thank you to all the players. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.